When my mom, she went through this intense kind of attachment to her faith in the mid 80s. She burned all the D&D stuff in the fireplace. She burned all of our action figures in the barrel behind the house, and burned all my Garbage Pail Kids, which were, basically the Mad Magazine type stuff, on the sidewalk, where she just put them out there, poured gasoline, and then lit a match. So yeah, those things, you'd like to think you get over those kinds of things. It was just so long ago, and it wasn't like anyone was hurt. But on an emotional level, like I was saying, to someone like me with my condition, I was like, oh, this is my stuff. That was my life. Part of that is collecting. It's like having objecthood and infusing into that objecthood a kind of person, right? It was like, I got to protect these things. I have to take this stuff in and like care and hold it, and because it may end up in a fire somewhere. Guston's work is actually a lot about blackness. It's about blackness and whiteness and the construction of race and all those things. And I think I just was pulling some things out of the air and being mean to myself in a way, but it's like, there's something to this phraseology here.
Welcome back to the Hyperallergic podcast. This episode, we're talking to artist Trenton Doyle Hancock, who is the subject of a major exhibition at the Jewish Museum here in New York titled Draw Them In, Paint Them Out. His work confronts the seminal work of Philip Guston. On the surface, these two artists might seem like an unlikely pair. One, an Ashkenazi Jew whose parents came from Ukraine, while Doyle Hancock, a Black American Southerner, grew up in a very conservative Christian family. But once you walk in, you get it. Both of them confront the history of American white supremacy with very graphic, stark imagery. Guston, for his part, is well known today as someone who rejected the abstraction that he had made a career on in the 1960s, and then started painting representational images that included hoods that looked like those worn by the KKK. Doyle Hancock, for his role, confronts that history in Guston's paintings while adding his own cast of characters. And all of this will be part of our conversation this episode. For this episode, I also asked longtime Hyperallergic contributor, as well as renowned poet and art critic, John Yao, to join us. John Yao has been writing about Guston for decades, but I just sense there was something in the way John writes his poetry and the way Trenton creates art that felt similar in some ways. A certain poetry that I saw in their work. And I think you'll see in this conversation that I might have been right. Much has been said about Guston's fascinating life story, but this episode, we're going to focus on Trenton Doyle Hancock and Philip Guston's poetic imagery, as well as their materials and their use of formal aesthetics. I think you'll see that there's really a lot to discuss. My name is Harag Vartanyan, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. I'm excited to get started, so let's go. Okay, and now we're off. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. This is such a great honor to have a conversation about your work, Trenton, and of course, John, who's written about your work quite a bit. I thought this would be such a great opportunity to talk about your recent show at the Jewish Museum, your relationship with Philip Guston artistically, and for people to learn about your work in general. So thank you for being here.
Hey, it's an honor to be here. Hyperallergic, as I was saying to you earlier, it's like Hyperallergic has been sort of omnipresent. It's like I don't remember a time when it didn't exist, so I'm excited.
Well, that's nice.
It is nice. So, Trenton, I want to start talking a little bit about your life, because I think, it definitely informs your work. And I think particularly with the current show at the Jewish Museum, Paris, Texas plays a big role, especially in the artwork that you have up there, the Paris, Texas Fairgrounds, right, from last year. So do you want to give us a little sense about your life and sort of, you were born in Oklahoma, I believe?
So yeah, I was born in Oklahoma City, and quickly thereafter, my mom moved back to Paris, Texas, where she was raised. And so it's sort of the only hometown I know. And, it's a town of about 30,000 people and pretty mixed in terms of, black and white. And, back in the 70s and 80s, I was kind of oblivious to a lot of things. I had a middle class upbringing, and people seemed to get along. Some of the strife from the previous decade had been maybe ameliorated a little bit by some pleasantries, southern pleasantries and things like that. But they were obviously still there. It was only in kind of getting older and moving away from Paris and having a perspective on what was lurking under the surface.
I want to note that there's a video piece in the exhibition titled Paris, Texas Fairgrounds 2024, and it's placed in a large cylinder in the center of the gallery floor. As you walk in, you see images of a fairground as well as images of a lynching taking place. It's a very eerie work, and I wanted to read a little bit of the wall label for you. The fairground of Paris, Texas, were a place of wonder and joy for Hancock in his youth. Only in the last 10 years did the true nature of the site come into focus for him. He had known that in 1893, the black 17-year-old Henry Smith had been executed in Paris by Klansmen. They paraded Smith through town, tortured him, and burned him alive before a crowd of 10,000 onlookers, who then scavenged his remains for mementos. What Hancock didn't know was that the horrific lynchings, so brutal that it made national headlines, had been staged on the site that subsequently became the fairgrounds. One of the things about that work that felt really poignant to me is when you walk in, your shadow gets cast on the screens around you. It feels like it implicates you as a viewer, and at the same time it echoes some of the imagery in Hancock's work that you see in the exhibition, where figures are sometimes cut out and we only see silhouettes. It's a very moving piece.
So I was able to come back to looking through that lens at what a place like Paris is, and for the purposes of, we're talking about the Jewish Museum show, when the Confederacy, when after the Civil War, a lot of those defeated generals ended up in towns like Paris.
Right.
And, and they had basically temples built for them and around them.
Right.
And so a lot of those, if you go back, a lot of the tourism for Paris is, these historical markers, these buildings, homes for Confederate generals and
right, defeated Confederate officers.
Exactly. Right. So places that when I was a kid, they had us doing, it's like, oh, we're going to take a day off of school and we're going to go and tour these houses. And, they didn't see anything wrong with that, and neither did we. We're just, oh, it's a day we don't have to be in class. But I always knew it was something kind of creepy about it.
So when they brought you to these schools, did they talk about slavery? Or did they just talk about it was the North?
Oh, not at all.
Confederacy in the North, and it was a war between the states, and it had nothing to do with slavery and economics.
Exactly. That wasn't part of the script.
Right.
So, yeah, those were things that shouldn't be revisionist, but it was like,
that's the revisionism we want to, some parts of America want to go back to now.
No, exactly. So I think that pretty much positions us where I am with the Jewish Museum show.
Right.
And you grew up in the Methodist church, was it?
No, it was like Baptist and Pentecostal.
Baptist. Got it.
Oh, so that's the hardcore, the hardshare Baptists, as they say. I think.
Yeah, no, they're fire and brimstone.
Right.
Yeah.
So very literal too about hell.
Quite literal. Like it wasn't like, oh, this is this sort of, poetic veil between, we can talk. It wasn't that. It was, there's a place that's just made of fire and you go there if you're bad.
Right.
Yeah.
And did you go to church? Did your family go to church every Sunday?
Every Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Oh.
And yeah, my dad was the minister.
Oh.
And all of my
That's
aunts
right.
and my mom were like
in the choir and missionaries,
all
right?
of that. So
Why Wednesday?
that was Bible study.
I see.
Yeah.
I mean, two things. I was thinking about you and your work, and two things hit me. One was that you kind of realized that you were raised in a fear-based religion.
Yes.
And that you then studied Joseph Campbell, and you realized that Christianity is part of many myths, not just dumb truth. And then it's causes quite a disturbance in you. You'd like really freaked out. You go to talk to the teacher. The teacher's really understanding about this. I thought, wow, what a wonderful person you met. And says, well, you have to deal with this, but there's one truth. It's one truth among many truths.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you've like discovered comic books. You have this your childhood life, and somehow you get to bring them together. So what role does Guston play in this? Because he was always loved comics, but then he comes back to it.
Right.
And we'll talk more
Good
about
question.
this.
Well, I like that you pinpointed that kind of nexus point for me it was around 1994, 95.
So how old were you?
I was 20.
Okay.
2021. So
okay.
right there. And so I had my kind of awakening probably a little bit later than some people. Maybe, they're 17.
Oh, it doesn't
18.
matter when it happens, as long as it does.
It
right?
does. And it totally happened. And, and it was very destabilizing. I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me, because it's like all that is true. Now you're questioning all of that stuff.
Right.
And questioning the people that told you those things as well.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, I'm growing up very fast, and the gravity's different now.
Right.
Luckily, I was able to find a new peer group pretty immediately that were welcoming.
And where was this peer group?
This was in Commerce, Texas.
Okay.
So this is not far from Paris, Texas.
Right.
It's still a very small town. The biggest thing in the town was the college.
Right.
And so I basically went to that school because that's the school my mom went to, and she's
right.
Like, well, that's where you're going.
Right.
And I was pretty compliant about those things at the time. She didn't quite understand that she was sending me to a quite revolutionary situation.
Right.
With thinkers that were so far outside the box that would have made her head spin. Right. I wasn't.
Right.
I love that.
But I was totally the beneficiary of this kind of amazing group of A students and professors, and also just people that had graduated, that stayed and populated the town, that were just, weirdos.
Right.
And so that was really a great thing for me. And that helped in that moment where it's like, well, Christianity is just this story, are these Bible allegories?
Allegories, right.
It's all just imagery that's up for grabs.
Right.
And, that was kind of, as scary as it was also very exciting. Because, it's not shortly after, it was like James Baldwin I'm reading, and people that helped kind of on the race, side of things, and the sexual orientation side of things, and civil rights and all of that. And that's where a friend of mine, my roommate, gave me some Raw magazines.
Right.
For that. So there's the Art Spiegelman thing.
Right.
And around that same time, I learned about Guston.
Right.
And I just saw him as another comic book artist.
Right.
Really. So it wasn't about painting so much. It was just about, here's a guy making this crazy imagery.
Right.
Yeah. So I just lumped it all together, really.
That's interesting too.
Yeah.
So you weren't people in New York were puzzled by what happened when he changed his work. New York art world. Mm-hmm. I saw Guston. I was at Boston University, and I had no idea that there was a hierarchy. I walked in and saw these paintings and went, "Oh, this is really interesting." They're really beautifully painted, and I just kept going back. And then,
where did you see them for the first time, John?
Boston University.
So there in the gallery there.
Yeah, they had a show with his work in it, and I was walking around. I think there was a Max Ernst there and something else, and I just said, "Who's this guy?" and then started finding out about him.
At what point was he in his...
That was like around 1969, 1970 when he just first... It's the first Ku Klux Klan paintings.
So those were what you saw?
Yeah, those are the first things I saw. I mean, I had seen him, but I don't think I thought of him in a certain way. Like in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, all they had is color field painting. They did not want to look at anything else. There were practically no galleries in Boston in 1970. So I saw, Motherwell and then Jules Zalitsky and then Guston. And it was like, oh, who's this guy?
Right.
But one of the things I thought about in your show with you and Guston is Guston never points his finger at anybody else. He's always, he's got the hood on and he's that self-portrait where he's pointing at himself. And then, and when he portrays himself in the hood, it's always as an artist, right? He's in a car, he's driving around, you see the stretchers in the back. So he's part of a club. Yeah. And he's saying, I don't want to be part of this club anymore. I have to leave this club. And he only does the paintings for a few years. And then he does, he takes the hood off, literally, metaphorically. But in your work, you don't really point the finger at anybody else either. I mean, that nerdy character is pretty interesting. He's kind of always implicating himself.
Which character? Because that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Torpedo Boy. Got it.
I mean, I think he's one of the great inventions. I think he's really, because he's nerdy, you identify with him, but you also see how different he is, and then you see his perplexedness. Like he's perplexed, but he also has a sense of humor and sees through what's going on around him. Maybe not right away, but eventually. And that kind of clarity where he sees things and then he suddenly puts it in perspective is pretty wonderful, because I think the viewer kind of gets like, oh yeah, I've been in that position. Somebody's doing a number on me.
Right. Yeah, well, thank you. And he's been this character that I've, worked with in so many different ways for, 40 years now. And this most recent iteration of him does exactly what you're saying, that's by design. But then there's this other component to that work, and it doesn't show up in every painting, but, I'd say 75% of the ones from the past 5 years is this, it's a different kind of finger pointing. And, sometimes it's in the kind of animated grids that are behind the characters.
Right.
Where you'll see, oftentimes it's Torpedo Boy's face, and eventually it's morphing into either a Klansman or there's this more recent picture I did where it's called Money Monster Management, or it's kind of an alliterative title, but it's the Torpedo Boy character with this dollar sign in his mind is transforming into a money monster. It's like a dragon. And it's, sort of to talk about this conundrum of capitalism and the relationship of capitalism to white supremacy and, this kind of power structure and the danger of, no matter what race you are, of falling into this space of pacification where you're, it's all about the money and, you overlook a lot of things, and before you know it, that hood is on. Right. And so that's, that's a total part of this most recent work. And so, yeah, I was like saying, a different kind of.
Well, it's also interesting because as an artist, when you become successful, that's something you have to deal with. Like, what is it that I'm after when I'm getting this attention?
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, there is this, what am I doing?
Right. What am I doing? Who am I speaking to?
Right. And so what's interesting to me is with the different characters, you have a character, the artist. How is that different? Like, how would you characterize the artist within that larger kind of toolbox of characters you use?
Oh, good question.
Yeah. Well, there's something that I've sort of separated out. Obviously, like all the characters are me, but with the artist, it's like, oh, they're like, oh, that's the guy. That's with the glasses on. I saw him at the opening, and they're like, oh, that's him. But it's not. Like, to me, it's the me with the most edges kind of sanded off and down. It's this character who is a marshmallow of a character, and he's very kind of passive in a lot of ways.
Oh, interesting.
So I project a whole lot of the, societal ills upon him, and he's just sort of downtrodden. He's like a Charlie Brown. He becomes like a Charlie Brown character. So the artist character in my work really doesn't have a whole lot of agency, but he has more than he even thinks, because he's the holder of the giant pencil.
Right.
And is the one, is the author. And then
that's almost the opposite of the way people see the artist, right? The artist is the only figure with agency, and everyone else doesn't have any agency. And you reverse it or upend it, say upend this romantic model, and then something else happens, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Well, for me, there's a kind of absurdism, I think, to playing with that trope that, oh, it's an artist with all the powers, like the pen is my sword and all of that business. And then to have this character that it's like, well, there's a contradiction here. I'm not seeing this knight in shining armor that's come to save us.
Right.
But how the total picture kind of plays out, perhaps with, if you add in Torpedo Boy or some of the other, it's like the dynamic then creates that it sharpens the sword.
Sword, right.
Yeah.
Because also Guston's artist is he's a fallen man. He's the guy holding the brushes but lying in bed. He's lying in bed with the paint beside him.
Totally.
And the nightmares on the other side. And he's like, what am I doing? I'll smoke another cigarette.
Well, I think, a lot of that comes out of, and, it's like having the show at the Jewish Museum, and I'm obviously like a black man, coming from a Christian side of things. So it's this like a mashing up of culture. But I think a tie that binds is this idea of humor, self-deprecation, using that as a way to cope and to kind of understand how to deal with the trauma, how to transform that into something that's usable, and protect, how to protect your mental health, And so I think the idea of that that deprecation is built into what I do, as a kind of a comedian, as a kind of editorial cartoonist, and
So it's anti-heroic in a way.
Yeah, totally.
So the other, I talked to Rog about this. So he loved George Harriman, and Harriman was Creole and could pass.
Yeah.
And that's also interesting that was one of the people he loved the most in terms of cartoon.
And those who don't know, he was the cartoonist behind Crazy Cat.
Crazy Cat. And I mean, I don't think anyone knew of Harriman's background at the time. That's only a recent thing. But it all makes sense when you kind of recodify and look at,
This species that can't get along, and one's in love with the other, but the other ignores them, right? It is so beautiful.
No, it's a wonderful, kind of breakdown of an American condition.
Right. And you talk about that a lot, the breakdown of things, that you kind of break down stuff into different parts to examine in your work. That's one of the things you do.
Right. Yeah, there's a kind of like a macro micro thing, I think, for Guston, like that he, over the course of his whole kind of graphic career, was doing that breakdown constantly.
Right.
And but then there's these very clear moments where you can kind of see it in slow motion, like you see the abstraction happen over a number of years, and then it slowly kind of comes into focus. But this is years, right? But then it happens minute by minute as he's making a picture.
Oh yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, it's really kind of a wonderful, I think, lens to look at.
I mean, when you look at the paintings in the Jewish Museum, you see that some of them, there's a painting that he did underneath, and he went, nope, that's not it. And then he just goes right over it. And that's great. I love looking at that.
It's so great because it's the things you don't see in books.
Right.
You know, it's like the experiential, like being in front of the thing.
Right.
You're like, oh, this is made.
Right.
This is like lived through. There's a history here.
Right.
And he was okay with that. And I think that's a generous thing.
Yeah.
About,
Yeah.
what he gave us.
I want to ask both of you about his earlier work, his prefigurative work. Now that when you look at it, what do you think about? Does it move you at all? John, I'll start with you because you may have a little bit more experience with that.
I'm still moved by the plus minus paintings and the ones where he's just standing and he refuses to step away and he has those beautiful red brush strokes. I mean, I think they're just beautiful paintings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have they changed? Has the later work changed the way you see the earlier work? Is there an obfuscation or something that you see?
No, I mean, he started off, in the John Reed Club. He was really pretty hardcore. I think, but he also was friends with Jackson Pollock in high school. They both get thrown out. Pollock goes back to school and Guston doesn't. And then it's Pollock who convinces Guston to move to New York. And my feeling is that Guston wanted to, saw Pollock and thought, I have to make abstract paintings.
Right.
And that was when you're doing it then, it's like you're on your own. As Frank O'Hara says, you go on your nerve alone. But he was friends with poets. He was well read. And at a certain point, I think you were supposed to leave everything out. And then he gets annoyed with this and decides, no, I'm putting everything back in.
Right.
So I think that's basically how I see it.
And how about you, Trenton?
Well, I mean, you said prefigurative. You mean like the abstract?
The abstract, right? I mean, not the earlier part, right?
Yeah. I always say that they're not really abstractions. Like there's something to me that's so much about the body, about that phase, and there's something quite violent about them to me that if you notice, like there's this kind of standard that he uses, this like architecture of like there's a coagulant of marks in the middle, like he's always fighting toward the middle of this picture,
right?
And it almost feels like how like you have a lump of clay and you just take your hands and you start like kind of grabbing at it, and those finger marks are in this clay. And that's how those paintings feel to me. Like he's grabbing at a body and he's squeezing and he's pulling, and there's like flesh that's being kind of torn away. So there's a violence to those to me, and there's this urgency to get at the middle of something.
Right.
And
wow, that's beautiful.
And and that leads, of course, to the later works where things come into focus. It's like that middle coagulant that almost becomes deep space. It's like moving into a body, then starts to form itself and become volumetric.
Right.
And that's where the forms start to come back in.
Right, the heads.
Yeah,
right.
So the marks are all still there. It's like that's what he discovered through the process.
Right.
But then like how to flip something that is negative to positive.
Right.
And then, he has that permission to get back into
yeah, and the art historian David Anfam thought that those paintings, the ones that have a lot of red in them, had to do with wounds.
Yeah, totally.
And the minute he said it, I was just like a light went off in my head. I went, oh, of course.
That's totally how I feel about it. Yeah.
And so in the catalog for the Jewish Museum show, there's a great drawing from 97 that says, that includes the words like Guston, but blacker and worse.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What you meant at that time, or do you even remember? I mean, it's been a while.
No, actually, I do remember.
Okay.
I was at Skowhegan. It was 1997, and that was the summer of finding myself. It was the summer of firsts. It was the first time I'd been drunk. First time I smoked pot. First time I danced in public. It was just all these things that I was told, you can't do this or you'll go straight to hell. So like I thought I would, just catch fire immediately.
I have a good friend is a Mormon, and he's talked about like the first time he got drunk was he worked in a coffee shop and he had the coffee beans wrapped in chocolate, and he didn't know the coffee beans could do this to him. And he ate a whole jar.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it happens when it happens.
So 97 was a really important year.
It was a very important year. And so, yeah, I'm just starting to try to think about myself as a person in the world, as opposed to a person in Paris, Texas.
Right.
It's like, all of this is open to me. And, so I started just playing with with titles and language. And that's where kind of the self-deprecation started to come in. It's like, okay, I identify with Philip Guston, but perhaps this is more profound than I thought then. But it's like the blackness, like where is because Guston's work is actually a lot about blackness. It's about blackness and whiteness and the construction of race and all those things. And I think I just was pulling some things out of the air and being mean to myself in a way, but it's like, there's something to this phraseology here.
Right.
Yeah. Right. It's also, as much as it's self-deprecating, it's also remarkably self-confident because you're taking on Guston. It's like other people are very derivative of Guston. And yet when I see you work, I don't think derivative. I think you're having a conversation with them that's not about style. It's about something else.
Because we couldn't be, more different as painters. It's like how we get to the image is so different. Right.
But you never left how you made the image. Many people did. And that struck me really strongly in his work.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And the focus these days has been on Guston, but it's like I had to fight through Basquiat. I had to fight through Motherwell and all of these figures that I kind of deemed as, these are the art gods.
Sure.
Whatever.
Motherwell surprised me a little. What was it about Motherwell that you grappled with?
Wow. Motherwell was one of the first at the Dallas Museum of Art. They have a great collection, and that was the first museum I ever went to, in high school. And I was a senior before I saw a real painting, right? And so I'm standing in one of the rooms. There's like a Lee Montague. There's like, giant Motherwell. It's like Elegy to the Spanish Republic.
Right.
And, it's got these giant egg forms.
Right.
Like kind of marching almost, wobbling across the picture. And it was so animated to me. So there's this, you read it from across the room, and then the closer you get to it, you're like, oh, that's not just white. That's these levels of gray.
Right.
And the black is not just black. It's also levels of gray.
Right.
And so there's this, like, how to break down a picture that seems simple into something that is very sophisticated or complex.
Right.
It's like a game. And so I think I first learned about the game of painting through Motherwell, actually.
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh. Yeah.
Because he's pretty explicit in that game, but that's great. And also because there's a political element to his work.
Right. It's like how to get content in.
Right.
But keep it at bay in a way.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's like really, really kind of amazing.
So tell me about that first visit to the Dallas Museum of Art, because, I think we all have those sort of experiences that really kind of open our understanding, of art. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, was it a school trip?
It was a school trip. And aside from the Motherwell, it's like a Friedrich Church, I believe. I'm getting the name wrong, but it was an iceberg painting.
Oh, yeah, it was Friedrich Church, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I came away, and of course I didn't have the words for this at the time and didn't understand what painting could do because, all I'd seen was comic books and a few, kind of fantasy paintings that me and my friends did, but didn't understand that you could get this kind of richness and specificity of locale and space and time in a picture. And I remember coming away feeling cold. Like I was standing in front of this thing and I was like, I need to put a coat on to look at the painting.
Wow.
And it was this very visceral kind of experience that it wasn't even like, oh, I got to go figure out how to do that. It was just mind-boggling.
Right.
And I kind of, it's like how dreams are mind-boggling or God or something like that. It was just beyond me.
Right.
Yeah, it still kind of is.
So were you overstimulated? Is that like, it's just, I'm trying to Because that's a really interesting response. You know, that's sort of like, were you trying to, what was that gesture for you? Like seeking comfort?
It wasn't overstimulating. It was, if anything, it was comforting because it told me that there were things that I didn't understand. And there were things that I didn't understand about something that I thought I really did, which was how to be a graphic, artist, how to make a painting, how to do these things. But here's this thing that's telling me, oh no, like there's a veil, and when you go past that, magic happens.
Right.
I was like, well, I'm forever the student, and I like that.
Oh yeah, I think that's important to always be the student, right? The great artists are always studying. They're always students. They never stop being students.
Right, which means you never take a vacation. You're
Right.
you're always at work.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I'd love to bring up some of the other characters you sort of created. Lloyd. How would you describe Lloyd to people who don't know what Lloyd is?
There's some characters that are more outside of me, and then there's some that I tap into something that I'm scared of about myself. Like this kind of the fire and brimstone thing about, the Christian upbringing, which I thought I had emancipated myself from, but this kind of judgmental thing, which I apparently have never really let go of, because when it comes out, it comes out.
Right.
It's like, I put things in two categories. It's like it's us against them, or it's
right.
Also growing up in the South, it's like football.
Right.
Like people think in terms of your team.
Right.
Right. So then there's this character, Lloyd, comes out of that. It's like in some ways the worst of all of that, but he's also a good character. He's still on the side of good, and he wants to right the universe and kind of balance things, but he does it in a very different way than another character called Painter, who she's more of it's about color, and it's about kind of falling into the beauty of color, I suppose.
Right.
And so, but Lloyd has none of that. It's like everything is black and white.
Right. He can't let go of anything.
Yeah.
It seems to me that's who he is.
Yeah. And he's a character I definitely needed. And he, throughout, it kind of ebbs and flows, I think, in, my narrative and my life, quite frankly. Like when I need that kind of character to come back. I think he's coming back now.
Ooh. Because of the situation.
Because of where we are.
Right.
And it's sort of a natural kind of, it's not like this is an abrupt thing. It's like, I need him now. It's like he's slowly been coming back.
Right.
To take the place of the Klansman, to take the place of, reclaim something.
Right. Because the situation's getting much more rigid as time passes.
Yeah. And it sharpens your voice a little bit. And I think he's one that it was all about his voice in the beginning. It's like, you deserve less, or he's kind of spouting this stuff of judgment at people. And that was at the beginning 25 years ago. I was kind of thinking about class and my place in it, and I don't know, the things I had been taught about upward mobility and black excellence and all these types of things. So a character like Lloyd was there to, I don't know, keep me held back a little bit, but also, I was angry. I was angry at the art world.
Sure.
Like for not letting me in.
Sure.
Or people that like me in. So
that makes sense to me.
There was an anger.
And how about the bring back?
The bring back is a character who's sort of like the Mound, and the Mound is a character that's sort of, I say it's the pincushion of all the the worries and angst of the earth. Like everyone just sort of stabs their fork into this one sad character who doesn't have any legs or arms and is planted in the ground, so he can't go anywhere.
Right.
So it's basically Mother Earth. So that's my character of that. But then the bring back is birthed in some ways from the Mound and has agency and is more rambunctious. It's sort of like the historic imp kind of character, but is there to help us access our memories.
Okay.
Yeah, and to bring back things from our distant past to help us unlock our future. So as impish as they can be, they're still there for a pretty positive purpose.
So some of these characters, I'd love to talk a little bit, because to me, they remind me of some type of cosmology or something you've created. Yeah. Do you think of them that way, or how would you describe them?
Yeah, I totally describe it as a cosmology. And, I think the phrase world building gets thrown around so much these days.
Right.
But it's how I was describing what I wanted to do starting in the year 2000. It's like I'm building this world, and it's additive and not subtractive.
Right.
So there's a center point that everything kind of answers to. I guess you could say it's like Stephen King with The Dark Tower, or so everything kind of answers back to this one thing. So everything's connected.
And you've made these characters, like you can buy these little characters that you made.
Right.
That's amazing to me. I was like, I want to see them so where I live in Beacon, I walked in and Cause had all these figures in the barbershop. I went, oh, that's why people either love him or hate him, because he's everywhere. And then I thought, when I was looking at yours, I thought, maybe Trenton could have dolls next to Cause's dolls someday, and then the world would be a little better.
Well, yeah, I mean, he and I definitely know him and respect what he's doing. And we had a great conversation at the Jewish Museum several weeks ago. And we're able to talk about just that, like how pop culture has brought us to the place that we're at. And for me, it's this things that are at odds.
Right.
Like I was always, punk without knowing I was punk.
Right.
Like, okay, I'm going to do, like I just have this urge to push against certain things.
Right.
And, I'd hear this from time to time in academia back in the 90s of, well, don't do that because that's not very sophisticated. Don't have characters in your work that are identifiable and solid, and definitely not ones that appear from work to work, like the seriality thing. But, I was a comic book artist. I was the, editorial comics and illustrator for the school newspaper all throughout college, because I thought, well, if this painting thing doesn't work out, I'll pitch my stuff to a newspaper.
Sure.
So I was not against
totally.
that. That was part of me.
Right.
And, but I also loved painting and discovery that way.
Right.
So it was just I'll take my peanut butter and chocolate and put it together and create this new thing for me.
In my memory, you start to show around 2000. Is that right? Or 2001? Because I was teaching in Baltimore, and suddenly these two students I had said, "Do you know Trenton Doyle Hancock's work? You better go look at it."
That's interesting.
Was that year important for you, or in that period, or when were those shows that were kind of like you felt were important?
Well, I had a little bit of a dip back into the 90s, and that's when I actually first started showing in galleries. So 98 was my first one person. So around 2000, 2001, when students were talking to you, maybe what they were responding to was I was taking the gallery space and turning that into, I was doing the thing that I was told not to do as a kid. Don't write on the walls.
Right.
Like you'll get punished for that.
Right.
So I was like, okay, I'm going to write on the walls so big that that's the first thing you see coming in. You see it coming off the street. You look in the window and it's just all this text.
Where was that show?
At Cohan's, James Cohan Gallery. Yeah. But I would do it in any museum show or whatever. It became sort of a thing for me, is that there's the written counterpart to the characters and the narrative and all that. So, but then there's the imagery. So I was like, well, why don't I just have all of that written, as I was seeing it as concrete poetry. It's like you could just isolate these things, and there's a kind of beauty that I was seeing in the writing part. And then you can hang the paintings on top of that so people can find how they want to enter into this whole thing or fuse it together.
So you play a lot of word games, like using the studio floor to make up the character with 2Z. I mean, it's all this wonderful game that kind of reverberates in any viewer's mind if you're like, open themselves up to it. To see all the, I mean, you're playing games on lots of different levels, and you're having fun.
And I think, hopefully, I think that's why we might be sitting here together, is like the way you use poetry seems to be like, well, the field is totally open. I'm going to take everything that I'm interested in, all forms of writing, all forms of oral expression, and kind of play this chopped up game,
Right.
putting it all together. It's like I was reading this one, it's like where you almost embody Yves Klein.
Right.
Yeah. And it's like this kind of role playing almost.
Right.
And like that was, amazing.
Right.
And
Thank you.
yeah, I just love, seeing how you jump back and forth.
Right.
I love that. So, okay, there's a couple of questions I still want to get to. This has been amazing, actually, already. Mad Magazine. I feel like that's something that should be talked about, because I think the playfulness comes through that. I think the sort of the type of drawing, obviously the common kind of heritage of like the sort of drawing with Guston and all those. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Mad Magazine and how you maybe see its influence linger in your work.
Well, Mad Magazine, I came to it, of course, in the late 70s, and its roots are, decades before. And, it was still functioned the same way it did before, but now it's on the newsstands and no one's taking them off and burning them. It's like the whole, almost like a McCarthyism type of trials that he was on to get these things. And people were burning piles of them. And so it wasn't like that when I was a kid, but I would say they were almost like how memes are now. It's like you go to Mad Magazine or Cracked Magazine, or, there was kind of these variants of it to see how pop culture is being lampooned.
Right.
Or how film is being kind of retranslated and kind of taking the steam out of something that was like, takes itself so seriously. And here are these guys. And I always thought it was fascinating that these are grown-ups. It's not kids making this stuff. These are grown-ups that are making stuff. And I didn't realize there were other grown-ups reading it. I thought, oh, this is just kid stuff that's for me. But, how sophisticated all that stuff actually was, got revealed to me later on. In the 80s, it was all superhero comics. And I didn't understand that there were underground literature and stuff like that.
I don't think underground comics got to Paris, Texas at that point.
In key places. You had to know where to go. I didn't know where to go.
So what were your favorite superheroes?
The standards like Spider-Man and Superman.
Okay.
And, but then there was something that happened, with Frank Miller in the mid 80s to the kind of late 80s. Things got darker because there was, even in the comic realm, artists in the fine art realm were kind of doing this already, but, being critical of, power structures and things like that.
The anti-hero.
Yeah. The anti-hero became the standard. Like,
Yeah, that's right. The Dark Knight.
Dark Knight, all of that. Yeah, the Watchmen. And so it was kind of, was seeing that out of the corner of my eye, still had everything, my feet firmly planted in. It's like, oh, I'm going to graduate and go work for Marvel Comics. And, it was like that. But I started seeing that, oh, there's this other thing. And I didn't understand. Like, I didn't know, I couldn't name the parts of government. Like, I wasn't a political being at that time. But I knew there was something really special about those types of comics because they made me feel weird when I looked at them. And they made me feel like I needed to do research. It's like I'm not well read enough. And it's like I could read Superman and Spider-Man, and it's just like, okay, I get it. But I liked that there were these comics that were out of my reach. And I wanted to fight to kind of bridge that gap.
I want to ask you about materials, because there's that wonderful piece in the Jewish Museum. It's divided up, and I was looking at it, and it's about the figure morphing, but then I realized it's done with fur. And I was like, whoa. And at first I was like, oh, it should have been paint. And I was like, John, calm down. And then it won me over. I mean, it was one of those. At first I was like, and then I went, whoa. It was really interesting. And then I started, there's the bottle caps and different plastic. And I was like, what's going on with this?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the bottle caps too, because those really fascinate me.
Well, the caps, it's like the bringbacks, how I was describing them earlier. Well, what are the things from your childhood, I mean, they don't always just bring back good things, but most of the time it's these comforting things that they bring back. And it was around the year 96 or 97 in this campaign to really try to figure out who I was, not who my parents are, not who my friends at school, all of these things, not who society's trying to tell me I am, but who am I? And, I'm getting back to this idea of intuition, like the things that are beyond speech, that we just do, are drawn to. And so I started looking at routines I had as a small child, and I would collect plastic tops because I loved the color. I loved the feel of the plastic. I loved the shapes, and they were toys to me. So I would take all those from in the house, I'm 3-4 years old at the time. And unscrew them, and I play with them and mix them in with my toys. And I was like, okay, I'm going to start doing that again. And that's when Torpedo Boy came back. I went through all my old drawings from the mid 80s when I was 9-10 years old. I was like, oh, I want that character and that one. Wouldn't that be fun to kind of bring back and flesh out, with my adult mind? What's the potential of all of this? And so being a painter, or trying to kind of figure my way into painting, I thought, the plastic of this material and my love of acrylic paint makes sense. It's like it becomes an extension of the surface, an extension of the material. And it's kind of a dumb thing. It felt kind of like, oh, this is questionable that I should be doing this. So let me move forward with this. And the material, the fur came around the same time. I started using that in the pictures as well. And it's like, make something that looks like it could hang in a kindergarten class, but shouldn't. Like it's deteriorating and probably might be more corruptive than educational. And so it was like striking that balance between something that felt right and wrong, I suppose.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that you connect the plastic bottle tops to acrylic. That's great.
Well, especially the colors.
I mean, then suddenly when you said that, I went, oh, yeah, all those colors that, which are used to identify what the thing is inside, suddenly they're not normal colors. They're this invention.
Yeah. And there's a purity to it too, because it has to sit on a shelf and like draw you towards it.
That's right.
Like a, commercial, like an advertising thing. So I felt that, like, well, I want that in the picture because I'm responding to the purity of something. Not it's all mixed up and muddy or anything like that. It's like moments of purity.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to ask both of you this question about, is there something unresolved about Philip Guston's work that you still think about for yourself? Anything that sort of, you feel is unresolved, or you find yourself thinking about again and again, that maybe it's because there's something about it that you haven't fully figured out for yourself?
Well, for me, I mean, he's going to forever be fascinating because he was able to make that leap, which is beyond logic, to putting himself in the hood and doing those paintings like that in the time that he was doing it. It's like it went against all financial and logical sense to do that. I'm like, what an interesting person, So yeah, he's going to be forever confounding and kind of dumbfounding to me.
And in one of the first paintings he does, Ku Klux Klan paintings, he takes out an abstract painting and he paints over it. Edge of town, you can see it on the left-hand side that he's really painting over one of his abstract paintings.
That's a great gesture.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'm really I'm interested in how haunted he was, and because I think he was haunted by being Jewish, and certainly by the Holocaust. All those piles of bodies. I mean, he really is haunted, and yet what he does with it, and that he has this guy sitting there, that his figure sitting among the bodies, or that he's really open to all sorts of things, the ants or the bugs coming down the mountain while he's painting furiously. And you feel like he's really dealing with mortality. He's dealing with all sorts of stuff, you know. So I kind of think that he's still open to like more discussion. The other thing that's really interests me is he's relevant, and yet you don't feel like he's trying to be relevant in the way you're supposed to be relevant. You know, that you're supposed to say it this way, or you're supposed to be on this side, you're supposed to do this. And it's like you can't pin him down in that way.
Right.
You know, and that I think is really wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think the self-deprecation is like really important, you know.
Absolutely. I agree. Now, do you ever fear becoming the artist?
As defined by
As yourself? As you define it? Because, you know, part of me thinks sometimes we externalize these characters in order to sort of understand them.
Yeah, I think the probably the reason I separated that character out to get in front of me is he may be the one I am most scared of, because there are no edges to that character. He's he's Dilbert, you know,
right?
You know, ineffectual,
right?
And not necessarily ambitionless, but kind of compliant. Yeah, and that's my worst fear.
Sure, I understand that.
Yeah.
So now I thought we'd end. I wanted to ask one last thing, which is collecting, because something, you know, I love to collect. I mean, I'm not a collector in the way that the art world talks about it, but I love to collect so many random things. You know, I love collecting propaganda. I love collecting these. And I feel like I have a magpie attitude towards it, you know, like I'm making a nest or something. I mean, like I wonder if like maybe I put them all in a pile and one day I'll sleep on top of them or something. I don't know, but I feel that way about them. I'm wondering about your tendency to collect, because I know that's something that's very prevalent for you too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, it's like I'm not sure what came first, the chicken or the egg here, but I've always loved objects. You know, I talked a little bit earlier about my earliest memories is collecting plastic tops, right?
Right.
So just being kind of drawn to things and wanting to almost absorb that thing into yourself. And so you have them in your orbit, kind of like the child's separation from the mother, and how that's so hard, because the child sees the mother as part of themselves. It's like a limb being separated. And I think there's this feeling that I have with objects. I have this kind of more recent kind of understanding of my autism, however mild it may be, that helped me understand, oh, here's why I did and do the things that I do. It kind of made me make sense, and made me understand, oh, this is why you were a little bit outside of the social groups, or a little bit of an outcast, because your syntax just didn't match up with everyone's kind of neurotypical understanding. And so part of that is collecting. It's like having objecthood and infusing into that objecthood a kind of person, right? When my mom, you know, this is a story that has probably been written in various interviews and with me, but you know, she went through this intense kind of attachment to her faith in the mid 80s, and she started to see my brother and I's toys and books and things as detrimental to our eternal
right. Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, so she burned, I call it the 3 trials by fire. You know, it's like she burned all the D&D stuff in the fireplace. She burned all of our action figures in the barrel behind the house, and burned all my Garbage Pail Kids, which were, you know, basically the Mad Magazine type stuff, on the sidewalk, where she just put them out there, poured gasoline, and then lit a match.
That is intense. That's right.
So yeah, those things, as you know, you'd like to think you get over those kinds of things. It was just so long ago, and it wasn't like anyone was hurt, but on an emotional level, like I was saying, to someone like me with my condition, I was like, oh, this is my stuff. That was my life.
That's devastating.
And I don't think she quite understood what she did. And so that's why I was saying earlier, like, what came first? Would I be the same collector I am now if she hadn't done that?
Right.
But I think it definitely was like, I got to protect these things. I have to take this stuff in and like care and hold it, and because it may end up in a fire somewhere.
Right.
That is so damn deep. I mean, I feel like I've learned something about myself with that story. That's so deep. How about you, John? What's collecting, or like the notion of collecting? How do you, or maybe respond a little bit to what Trenton said?
I suppose at one point someone said you're a collector to me. And it was sort of unnerving, but I knew the minute it was actually Tom Niskowski said it, I knew he was right. So I collect probably books, poetry books, novels, and then I love having drawings, but I have way too many. I've given some to I've tried to give in to museums now and stuff. But there is this part of me that really, I've tracked things down, like odd things that I wanted to have. Like I wanted a print by the Japanese printmaker Yoshitoshi. Someone asked me to write an essay. It was Japanese. And I said, if you're in Japan, you have to find me a print by him, and I'll trade you my writing for a print by him. So things like that. It was like completely impractical. I should have taken the money, but I was like, no, I really want this thing. So there are those moments where I think, or there's certain books, they're not particularly rare, but they're not cheap. And I go, I really want to have a copy of this. And then I go looking for it. Certain catalogs, that I know exist. I will spend months looking for them, waiting for me to find one at the right price.
No, you're a real collector. Yeah. There's no getting around that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Trenton.
Sure.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
This was a pleasure to have a conversation like this, and being able to explore just both your works, but also Guston in a very interesting way. And your show at the Jewish Museum is spectacular.
Oh, thank you.
And
thank
a
you.
very good catalog with it.
It is.
I have to say, it's a very good catalog with some really good interviews and writing that I think really illuminated so much about two artists, and the selection, the curating, the exhibition design, excellent. And so hopefully people will go.
One of the things about Guston is you want to make him human.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think that's one of the things that happens in this show, both in the catalog and with your work is, he was seen as a kind of godlike figure, certainly at a certain point, understandably, but he's also very, very human.
Totally.
And that's what I think comes across with this show. It's like, look at this conversation going on,
I 100% agree. So thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Draw Them In, Paint Them Out continues at the Jewish Museum of New York until March 30th, 2025. In case you missed it, though, I highly recommend the excellent catalog that includes an interview with renowned graphic novelist Art Spiegelman, as well as a lot of images and writing that will help you contextualize and understand the work and its relationship to each other very clearly. This podcast is edited by producer Isabella Segalovich. And now a word about our sponsors. This podcast, as well as all our podcasts, are made possible by our membership. So a big thank you to all our Hyperallergic members. For only $8 a month or $80 a year, you can support the best independent art publication out there. Now more than ever, we need publications that are fearless in telling the truth. So please consider becoming a member and visit hyperallergic.com for more information. My name is Harag Vartanyan, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. I'm very happy to be your host of this podcast series, and thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.